and welcome to our webinar, Resilience and the Power of Generative Questions to Foster Positive Relationships with Jennifer Ozgur, educator, author, and educational consultant. My name is Dana Asby, and I'll be your webinar manager and host. Today's meeting will last approximately 1 hour. A brief 15-minute meeting of the Childhood Trauma Learning Collaborative Fellows will be held following the presentation. We ask that fellows stay on. Microphones will be muted during the presentation, but at designated times, for example, during question and answers and breakout rooms, you will be able to unmute yourself. You can also use the raise your hand feature to request an open mic, or type your questions in the chat box. Thanks to a partnership with C4 Innovations, we're offering 1 hour of continuing education credit for participation in this webinar. We can also offer you a certificate of participation. Registration affirms your consent to receive an evaluation follow-up link via email and your consent to recording. If you experience any technical issues, please send a private chat to Ingrid Paget, our technical support manager for today's webinar. We're pleased that you joined this webinar, and I'd like to introduce Dr. Christine Mason, founder and executive director of the Center for Educational Improvement and project director of the Childhood Trauma Learning Collaborative.
Welcome. I'm glad you could join us today. The Childhood Trauma Learning Collaborative has a wide array of supports to help you as you work with children with the most pressing behavioral and emotional concerns and challenges. We have a newsletter that goes out, websites, and a variety of resources we can get into your hands very quickly. So anyway, we're very, very pleased that Jennifer is able to join us today and that you're here with us. And we hope you enjoy today's webinar.
Thanks, Dr. Mason. And now I'd like to introduce today's presenter, Jennifer Ozgur, who has been teaching in the Pennsylvania public school system since 2000. She's also an author, speaker, and certified brain-based trauma responsive and appreciative inquiry consultant and facilitator. When she's not in the classroom, she's delivering professional development, appearing at national education conferences, and facilitating sustainable transformational change events dedicated to supporting students, families, and their communities. Jennifer, I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Dana. It is such an honor to be here. Dr. Mason, thank you so much. I'm really, really excited to have this conversation today. So I will just go and talk about the background of my topic. It's about talking about resilience in schools, using appreciative inquiry and some other techniques so that we can have better relationships so students can flourish and their families and in general communities. So I want to start with a quote, and I'm just going to read it to you. In our scheme, we do not ask the initiative of our men. We do not want any initiative. All we want of them is to obey the orders we give them, do what we say, and do it quick. Now, if you think about that for a moment, and if you have any guess on who you think said it or when. So does anybody have any idea of maybe who might have said that or the date that that was first said? You can put it in the chat box right now. Interesting if anybody has any ideas. So kind of put that down at the chat box. What do you think? Who said that? And any dates? Anyone? Any brave people would like to take a guess? I'll give you about 3 more seconds. All right. No one wants to take a risk of it. Ooh, okay. Thank you, Vito. Let's reveal the picture. All right. I don't know if anybody recognizes it, and then bring up the answer. Frederick Taylor, that was over 100 years ago. So Ford was not right, far off the mark. He was an efficiency expert. He was one of the first consultants in order to get people to do things as quickly and as efficiently as possible, because the ultimate goal was to make money. Finding a way to, cut costs, make those widgets faster, And really, they didn't really think of the workers who are doing all of the work to make the company rich. They didn't really want their opinions. When they wanted their opinions, they would give it to them. So here we are, if you want to go to the next slide. Thank you. So that's basically an industrial model 100 years ago. Yes, and Ford was very successful using that. So very good with that. Top down, problem solving. And as far as how it relates to education, we're still pretty much using that. Here we are 100 years later, where you have the school board and the superintendent and the supervisors and directors, and then you have your building leaders and administrators, and then finally the initiatives, we receive them as educators, and then we deploy that to our students, and then it goes back home. And there's really not a whole lot of dialogue with that. And so here we are, 21st century skills where we want to be innovative, but are we really doing innovative practices to make that happen in our classroom if we're still using the same organizational model from a century ago? Next slide. Here's a different way to do it. And it's called appreciative inquiry. And what that is rather than being problem solving mode, where you've got an issue, what's going on with that machine? Why isn't it working? Who's responsible? We have to fix it. It's more asking questions. And it's not trying to solve problems, but you are appreciating the best of what was, is, and can be. And so if you look at that model, I like to think of it more like a spider web, where everyone who is part of the decision making, from, to apply it to schools, janitors, cafeteria workers, paraprofessionals, the students' parents, the teachers, and where we all have a different voice and we can talk back and forth, making connections. We're all interconnected. We're part of this living human system. And there is one person at the top, because you need someone to facilitate these conversations, or then you just have chaos and it breaks down. But as you can see, it's very, very different from what we've been working on, that same paradigm from over 100 years ago. The next slide. All right, so here's another quote, because I really love quotes because they're very inspirational to me. If you want to build a ship, you don't drum up the men to gather wood, divide the work, and give orders. Rather, you teach them to yearn for the vast and endless sea. And that is from the author of The Little Prince. And why I love that quote is, if you're trying to inspire teachers to do their best work, students to do their best work, instead of focusing on this very myopic, limited view of we need to get this result, it's more about this question of, well, why are we doing this? To what end? And to get inspiration by just this intrinsic value of, if you can inspire them to see why they might want to do something, then you can get more leadership where they get intrinsically motivated to do it. So that's why I really love that quote as well. So as far as inspiring relationships and resilience, that connection there is, you are less being very authoritative, where you are saying, I need to do this a certain way. You're more facilitating them, and you're repairing some of those relationships that maybe they've had that type of model before. So I was talking about appreciative inquiry, and where did that come from? And it was started in the early 1980s, mid 1980s, with Case Western Reserve, and that's in Cleveland. And David Cooper Ryder, he was an intern at the time, researcher, and what he was doing is he was starting to study living systems within the business world through Weatherhold School of Business there. And it's really special to me because when I received my appreciative inquiry training, I was there at Case Western. So it was very close to source. It wasn't a diluted or misappropriated version. It was, I got a chance to meet David, and he's wonderful. And he was doing this work, and the more he was interviewing different people in different businesses, he wanted to see not how can we solve problems, but businesses that are flourishing. and what are these contributing factors? And let's start to really analyze that with as much passion as how we can fix problems. At the same time, which is super interesting to me, is Martin Seligman was starting to develop the PERMA, and that was through positive psychology. Same exact thing. Instead of using mental health where you have, a person who's emotionally dysregulated and how can we fix them, it was, well, what about people who are resilient and they are living a life of wellness? What are those contributing factors? So one was in business, one was with people and social emotional learning and intelligence. And so my personal passion is to take both of those and start to interject that into the DNA and culture of educational systems, because I don't think, every time I ask a leader in education, do you know about AI? That's my question. And no, not artificial intelligence, but the first AI, most people don't know. So that's why I'm so excited to get this message out. So after he was doing all of this and he started to create this framework of these contributing factors, in the early 2000s, he paired up with some people at Taoist Institute, and they wanted to make sure that this practice was delivered with fidelity. So they created these systems, and that's what I'm going to be talking about and sharing that with you today. The next slide. All right, so there are 5 principles of appreciative inquiry, and one is not necessarily stronger than the other, or it's not necessarily in a certain order, but I'm just going to do it in a way that kind of weaves a narrative in my mind. You may want to reorder them, maybe create an acronym that spells something, but I'm just going to take you through them right now. So the principles that he was identifying that are in play for organizations to flourish is, the first one is the constructivist principle, meaning that words create worlds, that there is no one truth. Things are very subjective, and the words that I use can really color the lens on how I view the world. And it's very important to be mindful of the words that we use. We talk about mantras and what loop we want to keep on playing in our head. So that right there is the constructivist principle. So what's interesting about this is you may have heard this in other areas with other people and in philosophy or other educational principles, but that's what I love, is that if it's true in a bunch of different paradigms, then you can probably take it to the bank, right? So he refers to it as the constructivist principle. Second one is the poetic principle. And what that means is whatever we focus on can expand. So if I ask you, as you're in your car going down the road, notice how many red cars there are. Once I put that out there, you're going to start to see, oh my gosh, I never realized how many red cars there are. And then if I say, okay, now look at how many white cars there are, you're going to start to see white cars. And what's cool about that is that you can change that. So if you're filtering to look for red cars, and then I say, okay, now let's shift to white cars, you'll see that more. And so that's so important, because it's not a fixed mindset where, well, this is just the way I am and this is how I view things. Once you create that awareness, you can change that. And the poetic, why is it called poetic? Well, what does poetry have to do with that? Is, I'm an English teacher, and if I ask my students to analyze a poem through the lens of author as context, well, now that I realize who the poet is, now some of the symbolism might be a certain way. But then if I say, well, now let's look at it from a historical perspective, now you might notice other metaphors. Or if I say, well, what do you think the diction, why did they use a certain word? What's the color and the tone of the poem? Now you're going to see it in a different way. So that's the poetic principle. As far as looking through the world, what you focus on will change depending upon how you look at it, from what angle. Next one. Simultaneity principle. That means that things can happen at the same time, at the same instant, and as soon as I ask you a question, as opposed to making a statement, you start to think and things will start to shift. So That's why people go to, and I'm realizing it right now, that's why you go to a therapist, because they ask you questions. You make a statement about life and they'll say, so why is it you think that? Are you sure you think that? And you go for an answer and they flip it around on you. And it's because they want you to inquire about your life and what compulsions you might have, what's driving your behavior. If you go and they give you an answer, well, then the next time you have a problem, you're going to have to go back to them and ask them, ask them the question, they'll give you an answer. And now you're not shifting where you're evolving. So that's the power of questions. The anticipatory is that you can ask a question, but if you focus on the past, why did that happen? Why do I keep on doing this? And you ruminate in the past, maybe if you start answering those questions, now you're in the present moment. If you start imagining the future, that's where you can have radical, rapid, and transformational change. By you're imagining what might happen in the future, that awakens curiosity, it awakens play, and especially if you're asking those questions in a positive way, that's how you can transform living systems. And then the last one is the positive principle, where in general, living things flourish and grow to the light. And that is so important. Plants get energy from light, they get food from light. It's what people can grow. Now, if you focus on negative things, that is exhausting. It's draining, and you never get to that next level of growth and transformation. So that is that final principle, is the positive. All right, so now that I just downloaded all of that information on you, so what does that look like? How does that translate into any type of practice? So there is a very famous case study, and it's about 2004, because, as I said, that was when he was coming up with this framework to practice it with fidelity, and he was going into and consulting with British Airways. And what was going on is, they had done satisfaction surveys with consumers, and they said, what do you like about British Airways? How can we do a better job? Because we want to serve you to the best of our capacity. And people said, well, you lose our baggage a lot, and that's not fun. So that they identified that as the problem. They weren't necessarily looking at what are we doing great. They said, what do we need to do better? And so the typical thing would be, all right, well, let's have this meeting with all of our execs and higher ups and say, we've identified this problem. How is this happening? Go and start to research who's responsible for losing the baggage. And, now we've got to identify that, and we've fixed the problem, and we're going to have this meeting with the staff, and now we're going to do this new system. He did not do that. Next slide. In his wisdom, what he said is, all right, rather than focusing on fixing the lost baggage problem, at best, what are we going to have? Great. People don't lose their baggage. We want excellence, right? We want to have this stellar reputation. So what he did was he created this question, how at British Airways, can ensure that all passengers have an exceptional arrival experience? What might that look like? Imagine people leaving the airport, getting their luggage, they're excited to start their trip, or they're excited to get back home. What are they saying about British Airways, and how can we reverse engineer that and make that happen? That is much more exciting. That is a conversation I would want to have in a meeting, right? Next one. All right, so that kind of comes to my background as far as that.
So Jennifer, I want you to think for a moment about what we're going through today with the COVID-19.
Mm-hmm.
How might what you've talked about apply to our circumstances today?
All right. So in a situation now, appreciative inquiry, what it is not ignoring that there's a problem. Oh, nothing wrong here. Everything's rosy. It's not that. What it is saying, given these circumstances, how might we flourish? What goes into that? And so some people right now are dealing with severe mental health issues, right? So we do acknowledge that. However, there are some people right now who are using this as an opportunity to deepen their practice, to step in and really use those tools that they've been given. And they're viewing it through a positive lens of how might I take this experience that we're having right now and get me to the next level in life. And so the people who are in a deficit based, and if we go to them and say, here's how to recover from anxiety, it's still at best getting to people to neutral. A way to apply it in appreciative inquiry standpoint would be, who are the people right now who are seeing this as a way to step into their greatness? Okay, so why is it that you were able to do that? How is it that you have this positive lens that you viewed it? What was responsible for that? And then when you ask people that and they give you these answers, you could say, okay, now how might we apply that in other situations to our students?
Okay, I'm thinking as you're speaking that when we see our students virtually, or we make maybe occasional home visits, for some reason there might be a therapist who stops by briefly, or an educator who puts a packet of information at the student's doorstep. We have ways of connecting that can be very, very positive. And sometimes, from what we're hearing from educators, these can be more personal than they were before this situation. So I think that might be another example of how we can flip a situation, and even amid all the difficulties we're facing, we can start to see some positive experiences. I just want to say briefly too that when you first spoke with me about this, I focused on quantum physics and the relationship. And some of you may have a background in quantum physics or may know that whole general concept. And it is a very similar concept, one that if we focus on something, we can see it. We'll start to see more and more of it there. And if we have more of us around the world focusing on positive ways of getting along, on ways to combine our gifts and talents to help each other, then there's a greater likelihood that that's where the money will follow. That's where we'll have new legislation, new ways of giving in support of each other. So again, if we think about our world situation today, I think what you have to say has a great deal of relevance to all of us right now.
Yes, and quantum physics, like I first was introduced, and in no way am I an expert, but Deepak Chopra, who wrote Ageless Body, Timeless Mind, way, way back. I mean, now he's huge, but I think I first discovered him when he was on Oprah Winfrey, probably in the 90s. And when I was reading it, and he was talking about, have you ever been in this peaceful, relaxing state, and then you look at the clock, old-fashioned analog clock, and it just goes click, 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 and it just takes longer time. And he's like, we are light, we are energy, you are in this flow state where time is less meaningful, and you subjectively slowed down time. And it had pictures of quarks in this model, and I was like, whoa, like that's what first turned me on, that this old paradigm of the way we were taught is not necessarily true, 100 objectively true. And then to your talking about how can we flip this, and talking about legislation, what we could be doing right now as educators is to collect our own high point stories of excellence as teachers right now. We are masters of our environment right now. We are able to set up situations where we have the opportunity to connect with social emotional learning in a very deep and meaningful way. And if we collect these high point moments And then we can say, once we go, I don't want to say go back, but once we move on from the COVID situation, how might we leverage our insights from that state of emergency distance learning, and what were those contributing factors that we were able to have students own their education more, be more independent, have more opportunities to connect with families, realizing how important connection is, and we're not taking that for granted right now. So how might we then take that and use that in the future? So I would love for people to be very proactive right now and be mindful of how important our roles are as educators and educational leaders, and to start curating this data and these insights right now. We are given a gift with also being very respectful to how dire situations are right now. You can have both. It can be, yes, this is going on, and we might be able to grow because of that.
Let's move on.
All right. So, very quickly, just to give you a general idea, 5D cycle, all of the appreciative inquiry is very, very open source. And there are many models if you just start to do image searches of AI. But one is the 5D cycle. So you'll probably recognize some of this in understanding by design, backward design, essential questions, right? So it's just this 5D cycle where you define your parameters, you discover the best of what was, you dream about what may be in the future, and then you start to construct how this might look, and then finally you deliver it. Similar to lesson plans, really, right? But now that you have this different framework, it might create some more meaning for you as an educational practitioner. So, been talking for a while. I wouldn't be an AI practitioner if I didn't give you an opportunity to consider a question. So what I am asking people to do is get a little curious, and we're going to play a little bit. We're going to send you off into some breakout rooms, and you're going to meet some friends, and you're going to have a little conversation. So how does this, and we kind of gave you maybe some little hints, some ideas, some conversation starters. How might this approach that I was just talking about now help to restore some relationships with students and their families? And so what I would like is we're going to be going off with about 3 or 4 people in some breakout sessions, and just take about 30 seconds or so for each person to respond to that question. How might appreciative inquiry, what you just learned now, you're going to reflect and connect, how could this help to contribute to some resilience in your relationships with your families? We'll go off, have a conversation. After 30 seconds, each person take a turn, and then you'll be invited back to the large room here, and we will see what you came up with. So why don't we just hear from one person? What bubbled up? Normally I would love to do 2 more, but because of the time, let's just hear, is there one passionate person who'd love to share something that came up out of their group? And you can just unmute yourself and start speaking. What did you learn about AI and how that might contribute to the resilience of students and families? Who'd like to unmute? If you don't want to volunteer, I could call on tier on someone.
This is Vito from Nashua, New Hampshire.
Welcome, thank you. So what did you discover in your group?
Well, I think one of the things, and again, hopefully some of my group members can join in, was the shift from, I think we really talked, one of the members talked about the quote that you brought in about not focusing on the failures, but just focusing on the successes. And then the other thing we talked about was, asking questions to families about what do they need coming back to school to help with that transition. So, yeah, and then we briefly talked about how we've really seen some successes with the distance learning, and how we can bring that back into our classroom or our work environment. Sorry.
Thank you. And what I heard you say, especially with the asking families what they need, and where it's more of an open-ended, where I see so many times satisfaction surveys, strongly disagree, strongly agree, and then you just analyze, oh, look at this area, that wasn't so good. I now have identified this thing to do going forward. Whereas open-ended, what do you need? And asking all voices to speak. So thank you so much. All right, moving on. So one book that I really love by Jackie Stavros and Sherry Torres is Conversations Worth Having. That is not, you know, the title of the slide. That is the title of the book, Conversations Worth Having. And basically, you know, just what Vito was talking about right now, having those types of conversations are life-giving, and that's how you can become resilient in your relationships with your students and with the families. And so basically what we're doing is you could have a negative statement about a student, like you said, you know, instead of what, you know, why are you late? You didn't do well on this homework. This is late, as opposed to asking a question that was positive. Oh, I really loved what you did on that paper. How might we have more of those descriptions in your next paper? Now it inspires them, right? Next one. So it's very, very simple. If you know antonyms, then you can do this. So what is the problem? Well, what would be the opposite of that problem? Not just, well, what would it be like if the problem wasn't there, but what would be the opposite of that? And what would be the result of that? So if a student is always late, or if a student is not handing in their work, well, what would that be like the opposite? They're always on time. They're always handing in their work. They're always being excellent. And well, what would that mean? Well, they would be able to become a better writer. They would step into their creativity. And then you ask a question, what might we do together so that happens? Imagine what could happen in, say, an IEP meeting if you did the name it, flip it, frame it, and have true conversations worth having in these types of parent-teacher conferences, faculty meetings. And that's how we can restore some of that trust in relationships and become more resilient. So this is where maybe, you know, if we had more time, we could practice that. But I hope I'm clear enough in having those types of examples. But what you could do is you could just put that down, as I see people writing things down, taking notes. Maybe you could write that down for later exploration. Can you identify an area in your school that was previously deficit-based, and how could you turn it into a conversation worth having by flipping the conversation from a negative statement to a curious, positive question that would facilitate a good conversation? All right, so going on to this next stage of, you know, I was saying before, it is not that appreciative inquiry doesn't acknowledge that there are issues. Talking about, you know, this webinar about resilience. Resilience implies that you're able to, and, you know, I just was involved in a conference where we're not calling it bouncing back, but to bounce forward from any adverse situation. So if everything is going perfectly, there's no need to be resilient, right? It's being able to pick yourself back up from a setback and move forward and grow and learn. So there's a book where it's building resilience through appreciative inquiry. And they were talking about that there's this trifecta of 3 emotions, and hope, despair, and forgiveness. So through a trial, through a challenge, how can we build resilience is by acknowledging that there is some despair, and how can we filter that through and tap into our resilience and our tools in order to have hope through this challenging time. And sometimes, as far as talking about being resilient and in repairing relationships with schools, is to seek forgiveness or offer forgiveness and do some of those restorative practices to repair relationships. And so that's here another framework from another book, because you see it's in 2012. Once David Cooper-Ryder pushed this out there, people started using it. People started to write their own books and say, this is how I'm applying it. And so using appreciative inquiry and how that can contribute to resilience. And then next. And a way to remember that is they came up with this acronym. It's almost like a sentence is, how might we in all circumstances appreciate, love, and inquire through, the despair so we can have hope in order to venture and evolve as individuals, as relationships, as society, as the world. So it can ripple and expand. So here's another question, and you're helping me be timekeeper. I'm really trying to crunch it. I'm hoping I'm not over crunching it now. So do we have time to ask a question? Do we want to keep on going so we have some Q&A at the end? So I defer to you.
Why don't you go ahead, and if you have ideas, enter them in the chat box, okay? And as you do that, I just have a comment I want to make too about forgiveness, because I looked at those three words and they're not parallel, they're not even in their weight. There's hope and despair, which kind of seem, balanced in some ways, but then there's the whole thing of forgiveness. And we know that these come in waves, all three of them. And sometimes with forgiveness, particularly, I think we've been taught that just forgive, right? And I don't know where you are, but I know in my life I've looked back and there are times when I said, I can't, I just can't. I really would like to, but boy, it's just too tough. However, I could maybe start to forgive, or I might kind of put it on the back burner, right? So that it's not this grudge I have that I'm carrying around with me all the time. And then later I might take it off that back burner and look at it again, the circumstance. And I might see within myself a little different understanding of what happened. Maybe look at somebody's background or the situation, and perhaps there's a little forgiveness. And then I have to say, for me, there have been times in my life where I really thought I'd forgiven. And then years later, I look back and I can feel a deeper level of forgiveness, a different level, saying, oh, wow, now I really, go forward in a unique way because I have a deeper understanding. So with all three of these, I think they're critical things to know about, to think about, and they do impact our day-to-day lives in many, many ways. And they build our resiliency as we practice understanding each of them. Would you agree?
Absolutely. And, to use that metaphor of the onion, and there's different layers. And so maybe you can say on one surface level, yes, I forgive you. And, it's really what you're doing is you're releasing the burden for yourself and how it's affecting you, and to say, okay, I forgive you. For me, and through these lenses, almost like, Percival with the Holy Grail, how does this serve? And, people have wronged me in the past. Although, had it not been for that, I would not have been able to step into my resilience. I may not have been able to grow and to then be appreciative. So, what Mo McKenna who is an AI practitioner extraordinaire. And she has taught me to just say, that's interesting. Tell me more about that. Or, and not to be like very sarcastic, like, oh, well, isn't that interesting? But, there's a lot of energy behind that person right now. I wonder how is that serving them? How might I use that situation and leverage that situation right now for me to grow more? That's interesting. And to be curious about that, how might that energy that is being reflected to me, how might I be able to use that as a way to become more resilient, or to deepen my practice as whatever. So when you have that student pushing your buttons, wow, that's really interesting. I wonder what's behind that. How might I have that as a way to become an even better teacher or an administrator? Or, you get that negative energy from a parent. I wonder what's driving that. How could I step into my greatness as an educational leader to repair? Clearly they're upset about something. Do I want to be right? Do I want to have a battle of egos, or can I realize that we are interconnected, and everything, every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, and how might I take what they are giving me, and how might I receive that through an appreciative question?
I might just say, Vito just had a note in the chat box about how this is so weighty for elementary school students, and I agree. One of the things I thought about is restorative practices, and just a circle where you can talk with kids about the situation so you can help them understand a little more about each other and why something might have happened. And so you don't actually always have to say, I forgive you. You know, you might just increase your understanding.
Mm-hmm. You know, and there's that, you know, don't say what's wrong with you, ask what happened to you. But I would even elevate that more, because to say, well, what happened to you could also be very triggering as well. It's just like, wow, what's going on? What's behind that? Can we unpack that a little bit? Right? And so what you're doing is you're basically saying, like, I want to validate you. I'm confused right now about this. Can we figure this out together? Right? And I think that once they realize, like, I see you, I hear you, I want to help you, but I don't know how. So how might we work together so that we can get to this point that I know you're so capable of? Because in the past, I saw these great moments where you were able to do this. How can we have more of that? Let's bridge that gap together. And I think that contributes to resilience. Same as a coach, you know, instead of saying, what did you do? You dropped the ball. You shouldn't have dropped that ball. What was going on there? Oh, you were thinking about this. Instead, you could say, oh my gosh, look at the way you caught that pass. There was no way you should have been able to do that. What was going on? How did you do that? Let's have more of that. Let's analyze the wins with as much passion as the losses.
Excellent. Let's go on.
Thank you. All right, so this is the final one. It's LOVE, spells love. And I just threw this in here too because it's one that I came up with. So I just wanted to give it to you. There's so much out there for parenting, neuroscience, how to keep social emotional learning, so many frameworks, and it's all so good. And there's something out there for everyone. But I know from my perspective, sometimes I can get overwhelmed. You know, oh, there's this great book, there's Dweck, there's Duckworth, there's Seligman, and oh, I don't know where to look. Well, okay, if you just trust the wisdom of yourself and your life experiences, and when you're ready for those books, the right book will bubble up when you want to deepen your practice. But in the meantime, it's this simple. How you love your students, how you can love yourself, how you can love your children, parents, the community. Listen to one another. Active listening. Observe. You know, you have to observe your students, not just what are they saying, what are they doing, what are their nonverbals, what's appropriate for certain age groups, and to just really be in the moment and look. I just spoke about this a minute ago, to validate. That is, I think, for me, like one of my most triggering moments is when I feel you're not hearing me, you don't understand, or I'm just trying to vent. I don't want you to fix me. If I had a bad day, just say, I'm so sorry. And I'm like, oh, thank you. That's all I needed. And that also requires that emotional intelligence of empathizing, where, you know, what is it like for a student who maybe, you know, parents just got remarried, there's a brand new baby, I'm being ignored, pay attention to me, and they don't necessarily have that awareness of what's driving their action, and they're asking to be, you know, paid attention to by negative attention, and, you know, to understand what that's like for a student, or what it's like for an English language learner, and to, you know, really empathize. If you can just do those four, I would argue that I think we'd being a well on the road to helping students to become resilient. And to also do that if you're an educational leader, you know, what's it like for that teacher right now? What's it like for these families right now who are at home with you know, this COVID situation, and maybe you don't have reliable internet, maybe You have a student whose parents can't be working and are now picking up a couple of shifts, and you're expecting them to do homework, but they're working 40 hours so they can pay rent, so those types of things. So that's my final one. And so then again, time and everything like that. But here's a question that you might be able to write down that, in some quiet reflection, how might you love your students so that we can have resilience and a restorative relationship?
So before we get to questions, I'm going to start with a question for you. And we'll ask others to go ahead and start to formulate questions or put them in the chat box. But as I looked at your LOVE acronym and what's happening with it in your explanation, I thought particularly about validate and how there is a tendency sometimes, if we're not aware, to minimize where the other person is coming from. And particularly with children, to say, oh no, it didn't hurt that bad, And what I've learned, as an adult that I didn't know when I was a younger adult, right, is that we should always just listen and have regard for where the person's coming from. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that, about how damaging it can be if we just tell people, no, you're not really feeling that, or it isn't that bad?
Mm-hmm. So, so what was your question for me? Because I was thinking as you were talking. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think that sometimes there's a tendency to tell people that their feelings aren't valid.
Mm-hmm.
That no, you didn't really get hurt. Or, when somebody says, no, I feel bad.
Mm-hmm.
How can you respond in a way that validates the person rather that minimizes what they've said?
Thank you for sharing. Thank you for trusting me with that. That really means a lot to me, that you felt that you could share that with me. And, I'm interested, tell me more about that. And so, if there's a time where you say, oh, no, it's because really you're having trouble understanding their situation. So tell me more about that. And I think sometimes they may say, well, it was just because of this. And then maybe you start to understand it. Or just the fact that you ask, so, can you tell me more about that? Well, no, it was just, and it just diffuses it, and you see them relax. And, since doing all of this, conversations with parents have become much more productive to make that phone call home and to just let them know that they were heard. And anytime to say, and to never use the word but. I always use the word and, because but means everything you just told me, I don't accept. So to say, yes, I hear you. And how might we in the future XYZ? I just love it. Someone said, what book to read first? There are so many good books out there, but I would say The Conversation's Worth Having, because it is very user-friendly. It is a quick read, and it's in language and examples that I think is very understandable. And they also cite previous books as well. And then they have in the references more books that you can read. But I really love Jackie and Sherry's book for AI.
Jennifer, thinking right now about resilience and thinking about young children in particular, and how sometimes it's difficult because we're not in classrooms with them right now. And you know how important proximity is and that sense of touch. What can we do to help build the resilience right now of young children?
Well, every school district is different right now, how they are doing it. Some are Zooming, some are not. And there's, very valid reasons why they go in one direction versus another direction. But I think asking those positive questions as simple as, the whole gratefulness and gratitude. Tell me something in the past week that went really well for you, or what surprised you. In what ways did you discover some things about yourself, about your parents, about your siblings, about your neighborhood that surprised you or delighted you? What are you curious about? What would you like to know more about? And generating those positive questions, I think, is a great way to create resilience, because then as you model that over and over again, then that's starting to change their internal dialogue. And so I think after a while, then when something happens, they can say, okay, how might I use this? Because if they're used to reflecting upon their strengths in the past and then applying that in new ways, then they'll be able to say, okay, well, in what ways was I able to step into my greatness in the past, and how can I do that again today? I think that is a really powerful tool.
And what about for those children who are really struggling right now with academics? They're trying to learn online, but it's not working very well. What can we do to help strengthen their sense of resiliency right now?
Well, I think a lot of it is, the whole, I notice, I wonder, right? So, I couldn't help but noticing for the past 2 weeks, there's been some issues. So like the name it, flip it, frame it. I noticed in the past, there were certain times that you were really doing well. And, I'm a little concerned right now because I couldn't help but notice that there's been some difficulty there. Can you tell me a little bit about that? What's going on, and how might I support you in doing that? Or, that's one way to do it. Academics, I think, is always a barometer for other underlying causes. And, in what way can I support you so we can, and to remind them of some high point moments in their past. And so how can I support you so that whatever you were doing so well then, we can do now?
And we have a couple responses from our group. Dana, do you want to read those and maybe we can talk about them?
Sure. So we had some people say that this is a really trauma-informed approach using the and, which is really great. And then we also had someone say that the circumstance that she works in, that became secondary because connection is first and the back off on demand.
Mm-hmm.
And then we also want to remember that child abuse and domestic violence are up with COVID. So Sue's community is using a parent referral safe zone for families in crisis.
Can I just comment on that very quickly? It's Beacon Hill, and it's going to be expanded nationally. Other than the shame and the toxic waste that can occur with CPS referrals, Safe Zone families or Beacon Hills give families a break in the midst of a mental health crisis. So students don't have to face the shame of immediate foster care placement. And it builds resilience because it doesn't necessarily break down the family, but gives that added support, mental health first aid in the moment. So that's a resilience building, and it's inquiry based because we ask, what do you need, families? And often the answer is, I need a break, I'm falling apart.
I see that someone else says, meet people where they are. I believe that's important. A strength-based approach is important. Self-determination. So helping people to understand who they are, their strengths. And I always believe that, giving kids options, right? Instead of, here's what I expect you to do. Like, here's 3 possible things, and try to build off of their interests. Find out what's working well for them and try to give them more opportunities to leverage what's working, right? And then think about unique ways that they can learn. If an online learning isn't working that well, can you have some chats with peers? And together they come up with solutions and share with each other. I mean, we've heard from some of our fellows in New England about a tremendous amount of creativity and humor that kids and teachers are using right now. And I think it is a good time to go ahead and give people options so that they can be creative and innovative and play to their strengths.
Yeah, so what, I heard about what do you need? Well, I just need a break. And to validate that, and to say, so was there a time in your past where you felt that way before? How did you get through it? Because this is not the first time we've had setbacks before. I've had, moments in my life where things had unraveled and I put myself back together. How did I do that? And to think back to moments of previous resilience and what went into that. Oh, well, I forgot. I reached out to this resource. I realized that I started making more to-do lists, or I started, whatever it is. But to be thinking back about, well, when were you successful in the past getting through a difficult time, and how might we do that today?
And again, that triggers for me the thought that routines are important, some degree of predictability, some things that give kids a sense of security so they're not caught off guard by what we ask and what we expect are really important right now. So all of this will help strengthen their feelings of success and well-being. And all of that works towards building resiliency. So Jennifer, I want to thank you. Do you have some final words, and then we'll see if Dana has something more to say.
Sure. I guess when you were talking about that, Bob Greenleaf, who's an excellent speaker on the subject, and he talks about rituals. So right now, when things are topsy-turvy, to acknowledge, quite frankly, were we really that put together just a couple of weeks ago, or are we just kind of winging it week by week, right? And to say, okay, given the fact that we are in this new situation for who knows if, how long the long haul is going to be, how might we see this as an opportunity to create some rituals, to restore some order in some chaos, and to say, all right, so, what are our core values as a family? How do we want to use this more time together to establish maybe more of a routine? How might we, like you said, not lowering expectations, but reducing some of that stress load by saying, what are, instead of, all of these things that you must become as my child, but, 3 non-negotiables. And if you can just do these 3 things every day, and how might we support each other so we can do that? So, those are some things too that I think might contribute to resilience by asking those questions.
Anyway, I want to thank you for joining us today. And Dana, do you have some final words?
Yes, and this slideshow will be delivered to your email, so you'll get to look and see which books Jennifer recommends and also get her contact information. We wanted to thank you today for joining our webinar. Our funding comes from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, which requires us to evaluate our services. So attendees that provided their email address will receive an evaluation survey 24 hours after the close of today's event, along with the slide presentation. And it will also include links to request your CEU credits or your participation certificates. And we really do appreciate your honest and anonymous feedback because it gives information to SAMHSA to assist in planning future meetings and programs. We also wanted to invite you to join the Childhood Trauma Learning Collaborative if you are in New England. We offer free training and resources to New England schools, so please visit our website for more information or email us. We have a few webinars coming up. On May 12th, we'll be talking about a compassionate school approach to children's mental health. We'll be talking about our framework as well as the work we've been doing in New England schools. We also have one on May 26th about courageous conversations, a partnering tool to achieve equity with Maria Restrepo-Toro. And on June 16th, a trauma-informed yoga in schools presentation by myself. Thank you again for attending us, and please contact us if you have any questions. Fellows, please stay on for a short meeting. Thank you.
Thank you.